The Boston Tea Party, Part 1, The Storm Before the Tea. Imagine a cold December evening in 1773. The harbor of Boston lies still beneath a pale moon, its dark waters reflecting the masts of 3 British ships anchored silently. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, each loaded with hundreds of chests filled with tea, a simple cargo that would soon set the entire Atlantic world on fire. But to understand that moment, when men disguised as Mohawk warriors crept down to Griffin's Wharf, we need to step back. Back to the tension, the laws, the anger, and the sense of betrayal that had been brewing for nearly a decade. The relationship between Britain and her 13 colonies was once affectionate, or at least, convenient. The colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects of the crown. They toasted the king at taverns, celebrated British victories, and proudly called themselves Englishmen. But after the costly French and Indian War ended in 1763, something shifted. Britain was drowning in debt. And Parliament, thousands of miles away, decided the American colonies, who had benefited from British protection, should help pay the bill. Enter the Sugar Act of 1764. Then the Stamp Act of 1765. Suddenly, colonists had to pay taxes on everything from molasses to newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. What angered them wasn't simply the money, it was the principle. They had no voice in Parliament. No one representing their interests. Yet laws were being imposed on them all the same. Out of this outrage was born a rallying cry that echoed from New England to the Carolinas. No taxation without representation. This phrase became the heartbeat of resistance. Meetings filled town halls. Pamphlets spread like wildfire. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, founded in Boston, organized protests that were sometimes peaceful, and sometimes not. Boston was the beating heart of rebellion. A small port city, but fiercely independent and full of spirit. Its cobblestone streets buzzed with talk of liberty, of rights, of tyranny. And its taverns, like the famous Green Dragon, became headquarters of political agitation. Here, fiery voices rose above the din of ale mugs and pipe smoke. Samuel Adams, the master organizer and agitator, whose passion turned ordinary citizens into revolutionaries. John Hancock, the wealthy merchant with a taste for both fine clothes and defiance. And Paul Revere, silversmith by trade, but messenger and patriot at heart. These men, and countless others, built networks of communication that spread far beyond Massachusetts. They formed committees of correspondence, sharing news and strategies with other colonies. It was through Boston's energy and defiance that a once scattered group of colonies began to see themselves as part of something larger, a movement for liberty. But while Boston's spirit burned hot, Britain's patience ran cold. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, taxing imported goods like glass, paper, and, yes, tea. The colonists responded with boycotts. They refused to buy British goods, choosing instead to make their own clothes, grow their own produce, and brew herbal, Liberty tea, from local herbs instead of imported leaves. These acts hit merchants hard, and tensions escalated. When protests grew rowdy, Britain sent troops to Boston to keep order. Redcoats filled the streets, a constant reminder of British control. For Bostonians, it felt like an occupation. Then, in March 1770, the tension exploded. A crowd of angry colonists confronted British soldiers outside the customs house. Snowballs turned to stones. Insults turned to chaos. Shots rang out. 5 men lay dead, including a black sailor named Crispus Attucks, the first to fall for the cause of liberty. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's engraving of the scene, though exaggerated, spread across the colonies, painting the British as ruthless killers. Outrage surged again. Britain repealed most of the Townshend duties soon after, except for one. They kept the tax on tea. Why tea? Because it was symbolic. It reminded the colonists who was in charge. By 1773, Britain's most powerful trading company, the British East India Company, was in trouble. Its warehouses overflowed with tea that no one wanted to buy, not in England, not in the colonies. So Parliament passed the Tea Act, allowing the company to sell directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. The tea would actually be cheaper, even with the tax, but it would still be taxed. This was no economic favor. It was a political trap. If the colonists bought the tea, they would be accepting Parliament's right to tax them. If they refused, the company, and the empire, would suffer. When the news reached the colonies, outrage spread like lightning. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, patriots forced tea ships to turn back. But in Boston, things would not go so smoothly. In late November 1773, the first ship, the Dartmouth, arrived in Boston Harbor with 114 chests of East India Company tea. Crowds gathered at the docks as word spread through the city. Under the law, the tea had to be unloaded within 20 days, or the cargo would be confiscated by customs officials, and duties would be enforced by the British Navy. The Sons of Liberty immediately called a mass meeting at Faneuil Hall, then moved to the larger Old South Meeting House when the crowd overflowed. Thousands packed the pews, merchants, sailors, apprentices, farmers, all shouting their defiance. Samuel Adams presided, his voice calm but firm. "A hand is laid upon the sacred ark of liberty," he declared. "We must defend it." Over the following days, the debate raged. Could they send the tea back? Could they find a legal loophole? Or would they be forced to choose open defiance? Governor Thomas Hutchinson, loyal to the crown, refused to allow the ships to leave. He insisted that the tea be unloaded and the tax paid. For the colonists, that was unacceptable. For them, this was not just about tea, it was about power, dignity, and freedom. As the December deadline approached, the streets of Boston were electric with tension. British soldiers patrolled the town, while Patriot guards kept watch on the ships. The Sons of Liberty held nightly meetings, their plans whispered behind closed doors. Each day, more citizens joined the protests. Church bells rang to call people to meetings. Lanterns flickered in the frosty night air as men spoke of resistance, of honor, of sacrifice. Some feared war. Others welcomed it. On December 16, 1773, the final meeting was held at the Old South Meeting House. More than 5,000 people crammed inside, one of the largest gatherings in colonial history. Outside, the winter wind howled through the narrow streets. Inside, the debate burned hot. Word came from the governor, he would not relent. The tea must be unloaded. The tax must be paid. A hush fell over the hall. All eyes turned to Samuel Adams. He rose slowly, his face calm but his voice sharp. "This meeting," he said, "can do nothing more to save the country." Those words were the signal. Outside, a shout pierced the cold night air. "Mohawks," someone cried, the agreed-upon code. Men slipped away from the meeting house, pulling blankets and feathers over their clothes. They blackened their faces with soot and ash, not to mock, but to disguise. To the British, they would appear as native warriors. To each other, they were brothers in defiance. They moved silently through the streets, hundreds of them, gathering at Griffin's Wharf where the ships waited in the dark. Crowds followed at a distance, whispering, trembling, unsure of what would happen next. The hour of decision had come. Not one of speeches, or petitions, but of action. Boston, restless, proud, and unafraid, was about to cross a line from protest to revolution. Part 2, The Night of the Tea Party. The air that December evening bit with the chill of a New England winter. Boston Harbor lay still, its black water mirroring the faint glow of lanterns flickering along the wharf. The year was 1773, December 16, a night that would echo through centuries. The crowd that had poured from the Old South Meeting House spilled into the icy streets. Men shouted, women urged their husbands on, boys scrambled over fences to catch a glimpse. The time for talk was over. Boston had chosen defiance. From dark alleys and tavern cellars, men began to emerge, cloaked in blankets and feathers, faces smeared with soot and ash. Some carried hatchets, others poles or clubs. The disguises were crude, symbolic. They called themselves Mohawks, a nod to freedom and resistance, not to deception. They wanted it known that this was not mob violence, it was protest with purpose. Among them were merchants, craftsmen, apprentices, ordinary men. Paul Revere, the silversmith. George Hughes, a humble shoemaker. Even young boys who would later boast, "I was there that night when Boston defied the king." They spoke little as they gathered at Griffin's Wharf. The harbor's icy breath stung their faces, but adrenaline warmed their blood. Nearby, 3 ships waited, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, each moored close together, each heavy with the East India Company's tea. Just past 6 o'clock, the sound of a war whoop split the night, a long, sharp cry that made hearts pound and windows shake. Drums began to beat in rhythm with marching feet. The men moved through the narrow streets, 100 strong, followed by a murmuring crowd of spectators. Mothers held their children close, old men nodded in grim approval. As they reached the wharf, the ships loomed before them, silent giants against the cold sky. Their captains stood nervously by, uncertain what was about to unfold. The British soldiers, quartered elsewhere that night, did not intervene. The local customs officers and loyalist officials stayed out of sight. The town's militia watched but did not move. Boston, it seemed, was holding its breath. A small group of Mohawks approached the first ship, the Dartmouth. "Who goes there?" a sailor called out. "Friends of liberty and the country," came the reply. Permission was demanded, and granted. The crew, sympathetic to the cause, stood aside. A command rang out. "Hand me that hatchet, and pass up the chest." The first crate of tea was dragged on deck. A single blow split it open, spilling dark leaves across the planks. For a moment, everyone froze, as if realizing they had crossed a line from words to revolution. Then, another chest. And another. The rhythm began, chop, smash, dump. Chop, smash, dump. Men worked in organized teams, some prying open lids, others hauling crates, others tossing the tea overboard. The harbor churned with leaves, turning black and fragrant under the moonlight. For more than 3 hours, the harbor rang with the sound of splintering wood and crashing waves. Over 300 chests, nearly 90,000 pounds of tea, were destroyed. Not a single drop of rum was stolen, not a single sailor harmed, not a single crate of anything else touched. This was not riot, it was discipline. Revolution with order. Witnesses said that when one man tried to pocket some tea for himself, he was immediately confronted by the others. "We came to destroy, not to plunder," they warned, and the thief was sent away in shame. Even in rebellion, there was principle. The wind carried the rich scent of tea across the water, strong, bitter, unmistakable. Men laughed, shouted, cheered, and yet worked with precision. From the docks, onlookers clapped and hollered approval. Women waved handkerchiefs from windows. The town had become one beating heart. Some said it looked like a ritual, men silhouetted against lantern light, swinging axes in rhythm, the tea cascading into the harbor like black rain. Others said it felt like destiny, as if Boston itself was rising from its knees. By midnight, the work was done. The decks were swept clean, literally. The Mohawks even brushed away stray tea leaves, leaving the ships as tidy as before. They wanted no accusation of theft, no stain of drunken chaos. Only a clear message. Then, as quietly as they had come, they slipped away into the night. Some walked back through the darkened streets, their disguises discarded in the snow. Others melted into taverns or homes. The harbor fell silent again, save for the gentle lapping of water against the hulls, water now steeped in the world's most expensive tea. One witness wrote later, "The next morning, the harbor looked like a giant teapot. Indeed, the water was stained brown for days. When dawn broke on December 17, Boston awoke to the smell of rebellion. The news spread faster than the tide. Word raced through the streets, then out into the countryside. Riders carried the story to New York, to Philadelphia, to Virginia. By the week's end, the whole continent knew, Boston had destroyed the king's tea. The reaction was mixed, even among patriots. Some feared that the act had gone too far, that Britain would retaliate with overwhelming force. Others rejoiced, declaring that freedom had finally found its voice. John Adams, who had not joined the raid but supported its cause, wrote in his diary, "This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, that it must have important consequences. It is an epoch in history." He was right. News of the event took weeks to cross the Atlantic, but when it reached London, Parliament erupted in outrage. The king himself, George III, reportedly fumed, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." The East India Company demanded repayment for the destroyed tea, valued at nearly £10,000 sterling, an enormous sum. British merchants cried out for justice. The government responded with fury. They called it the Boston Tea Party, though the name came later, and to them, it was nothing less than an act of treason. In the months that followed, Boston held its breath. British ships began to arrive more frequently in the harbor, their cannons glinting in the sun. Loyalists whispered that the city would soon pay dearly. Patriots prepared for the worst. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty continued to meet, now in secrecy. They knew what was coming, and they were right. In early 1774, Parliament passed a series of harsh laws meant to crush the spirit of Boston once and for all. The colonists would come to call them the Coercive Acts, or, more bitterly, the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston would be closed. Its government would be placed under direct royal control. British soldiers would be quartered in colonial homes. Justice itself would be shipped across the ocean. But before those punishments struck, there was still a strange, proud calm in the city. Bostonians walked the same streets where they had defied an empire. They whispered stories of the men who had dumped the tea, each claiming to know someone who was there, though most names remained secret for decades. They held their heads high, even as British ships loomed offshore. They had made their stand. They had declared, without words, that liberty was worth the risk. What began as a protest over tea had become a question of sovereignty, who ruled whom. The colonists no longer argued merely about taxes. They spoke of natural rights, of government by consent, of freedom itself. The Boston Tea Party had turned a quarrel into a cause. And in doing so, it lit a fuse that would soon ignite the revolution. Part 3, The Empire Strikes Back. The morning after the Boston Tea Party, the harbor lay still, silent, calm, but forever changed. The black leaves of destroyed tea floated on the tide like a dark omen. Boston had defied the most powerful empire on earth. And across the ocean, that empire was about to respond. For a brief moment, the colonists believed they had made their point, that the destruction of the tea would awaken reason in Parliament. But they underestimated how deeply they had wounded Britain's pride. The British government did not see an act of justice. They saw rebellion. And rebellion had to be crushed. In early 1774, the news reached London. It arrived in the form of letters and affidavits, all describing the same unbelievable event. Men dressed as savages had boarded His Majesty's ships, destroyed valuable property, and humiliated the British crown. Parliament erupted in fury. Newspapers screamed for vengeance. Merchants demanded repayment. The East India Company, already drowning in debt, begged the government to act. King George III listened to his ministers with growing anger. "The die is now cast," he declared. "The colonies must either submit or triumph." Those words sealed Boston's fate. Within weeks, Parliament passed a set of laws that would change everything. Officially, they were the coercive acts. In America, they would be remembered with bitterness as the intolerable acts. Each law was designed to punish Boston, to make the city an example to all others. First, came the Boston Port Act. On June 1, 1774, Boston Harbor was shut down completely. No ships could enter or leave. No trade, no fishing, no goods, no income. Thousands of workers, sailors, dockhands, merchants, were thrown into poverty overnight. The lifeblood of the city was cut off. Second, the Massachusetts Government Act. The Crown stripped the colony of its right to self-rule. The elected council was dissolved. The royal governor gained absolute power. Town meetings, once the heart of New England democracy, were banned without permission. Boston's voice was silenced. Third, the Administration of Justice Act. Any British soldier or official accused of a crime in the colonies could be sent to England for trial, far away from local juries. To colonists, this was not justice, it was protection for tyranny. Fourth, the Quartering Act. British troops could now be housed in colonial homes, taverns, even private residences, without consent. Imagine waking to find redcoats sleeping in your parlor, eating your food, watching your family. To the colonists, it was humiliation made law. And finally came the Quebec Act, which extended Canada's borders southward and granted religious freedom to Catholics. To many Protestants in New England, it looked like a deliberate move to box them in, and favor those they distrusted. The message was clear: Boston would pay for its defiance. Britain would restore order, by force if necessary. But something extraordinary happened instead. Instead of isolating Boston, the punishment united the colonies. What had begun as a local protest became a continental cause. When word of the Port Act reached the other colonies, wagons began to roll toward Massachusetts loaded with food, grain, and supplies. From New York and Pennsylvania, from Virginia and the Carolinas, aid poured in. Charleston shipped rice. Farmers from Connecticut sent cattle. Even tiny villages held prayer meetings and fundraisers. Boston's suffering, they said, is the suffering of us all. Newspapers printed calls for solidarity. Letters of support circulated between colonial leaders. And out of that wave of empathy rose a new idea: the need for a unified voice. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, all except Georgia, gathered in Philadelphia. It was called the First Continental Congress. They met not as separate colonies, but as one people for the first time. Some wore fine coats and powdered wigs, others were frontier men with rough manners. But in that hall, they were equals. There was George Washington from Virginia, calm and reserved. Patrick Henry, fiery and eloquent, who declared, the distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. There was John Adams, sharp and determined, alongside his cousin Samuel Adams, the architect of Boston's rebellion. And there was John Dickinson, and many more, men who would one day sign the Declaration of Independence. For weeks they debated, should they seek reconciliation or prepare for war. They decided, for now, on unity and resistance. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, affirming loyalty to the king but rejecting Parliament's authority to tax or govern without consent. They called for a boycott of British goods, known as the Continental Association, and encouraged every colony to prepare militias, just in case. Before adjourning, they promised to meet again if Britain did not respond fairly. In that moment, America had found its first political body, its first step towards self-government. Meanwhile, back in Boston, life had become unbearable. British warships blockaded the harbor. Redcoats patrolled the streets. Cannon stood ready on the hills. The city was a cage. Governor Thomas Gage, now appointed military ruler of Massachusetts, enforced the new laws with iron discipline. He seized gunpowder from colonial storehouses, banned town meetings, and fortified the Boston Neck, the only land route into the city. But Bostonians would not be broken. Secret meetings continued in taverns and homes. Men trained quietly with muskets and powder horns. Farmers in the countryside began calling themselves Minutemen, ready to fight at a minute's notice. And all the while, the story of the Tea Party remained a beacon. What those men had done, standing up to imperial power, became a symbol of courage. "Remember Boston," became the cry across the colonies. Patrick Henry thundered in Virginia's House of Burgesses. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it. In Boston, pamphleteers like Thomas Young and Joseph Warren wrote essays declaring that liberty was not granted by kings, it was the birthright of all men. Ministers preached that tyranny was sin. Farmers whispered that war was coming. The people were no longer afraid, they were angry, proud, determined. By the spring of 1775, the colonies were a powder keg. And the spark, once again, would strike in Massachusetts. In April, General Gage received secret orders from London: disarm the rebels. Arrest their leaders. End the resistance before it spread. On the night of April 18, he sent 700 British troops marching quietly toward the countryside, aiming to seize colonial weapons stored in the town of Concord, and perhaps capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were hiding nearby. But Boston's network of patriots was watching. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode into the darkness, spreading the alarm. The regulars are coming out. When British troops reached Lexington at dawn, they found a small band of Minutemen waiting on the green. The two sides faced each other, farmers with muskets against trained soldiers of the Empire. Someone fired a shot. No one knew who. But that single gunshot shattered the peace of the continent. It became known as the shot heard round the world. Within hours, smoke rose over Concord's bridges and fields. British troops retreated under fire. Colonial militias surrounded Boston. The siege of the city began. And with it, the American Revolution. Looking back, it seems incredible that a simple protest against tea could lead to independence, to a new nation, to an entirely new vision of freedom. But revolutions rarely begin with grand declarations. They start with ordinary people refusing to yield. The Boston Tea Party was not just about taxes or tea, it was about dignity, self-determination, and the belief that government exists by the consent of the governed. Those men who crept to Griffin's Wharf in the winter of 1773 did not know they were starting a revolution. They only knew they could no longer live as subjects without a voice. Their defiance inspired a generation, and their courage laid the foundation for the world's first great experiment in liberty. Today, when we speak of the Boston Tea Party, it's easy to picture a quaint act of protest, men tossing tea into a harbor. But to those who lived it, it was an act of war against oppression. It was the moment when the colonies stopped begging for fairness and began demanding freedom. Decades later, John Adams would recall that night and say, "There is a connection between the destruction of the tea and the Declaration of Independence." The seeds were sown that evening. And indeed they were. From that harbor soaked in tea leaves grew the roots of a nation, one built not on submission, but on resistance, not on privilege, but on principle. If you stand today on Boston's waterfront, you can almost hear the echoes, the creak of wooden ships, the crash of tea chests, the whispers of men daring to be free. The smell of salt and rebellion lingers in the wind. The water is calm now, but beneath its surface lies the memory of that December night, when America first declared its right to choose its own destiny. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint murmur of those defiant voices carried on the tide. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. With those words, the course of history changed. And a revolution was born. The end. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.